The Testaments reveals Aunt Lydia's darkest secret yet, and it changes everything we thought we understood about power, punishment, and survival inside Gilead. Because for years, Aunt Lydia has been presented as something almost unbreakable, a symbol of discipline, a face of control, a woman who enforces the rules of Gilead with precision and terrifying calm. But underneath that authority, there has always been something harder to explain: a tension, a history that never fully adds up. And in the Testaments, that hidden layer begins to surface in a way that completely reframes her entire existence. The question is not just who Aunt Lydia is. The question is who she was allowed to become. And more importantly, who forced her into it. What makes this reveal so unsettling is how quietly it is delivered. There is no dramatic confession, no sudden emotional breakdown. Instead, it comes through fragments. Small lines, carefully placed memories, a suggestion of lineage. A hint that Aunt Lydia did not simply appear inside Gilead, fully formed as an instrument of control, but was reshaped, broken, and rebuilt into it. And once you start putting those fragments together, a disturbing picture emerges. Before Gilead, Lydia was not a powerful figure. She was not feared. She was not respected. She was, in many ways, invisible. A woman navigating a world that already discounted her value long before any regime took control. That invisibility matters because it explains the foundation of everything she becomes later. People often assume cruelty is born from strength, but in Lydia's case, it is something more complicated. It is survival disguised as authority, and the Testaments slowly reveals that her transformation did not begin with ideology. It began with fear of being erased, fear of irrelevance, fear of a world that had already decided she did not matter. So when Gilead rises, it does not just offer her structure, it offers her identity. For the first time, she is given a role that makes her visible, a purpose that makes her necessary. And that is where the first fracture begins, because what Gilead gives with one hand, it takes with the other. The control system of Gilead is not just political, it is psychological. It demands submission not only from the oppressed, but also from those enforcing it. And Lydia, in her early days as an aunt, is not the fully hardened figure we later come to know. She is still adapting, still learning what it costs to hold power in a system built on fear. And that is where the darker secret begins to take shape. Because the hints dropped in the Testaments suggest that Lydia's loyalty was not always ideological. It was conditional, survival-based. And at some point, that survival required her to make a choice that cannot be undone, a choice that reshaped her entire moral identity. There is a subtle but powerful implication that Lydia did not simply rise through Gilead through obedience alone. She understood the system, yes, but more importantly, she understood how to survive its cruelty by becoming indispensable to it. That means learning when to enforce punishment and when to withhold mercy. Learning how to read power not as law, but as behavior. And that is what makes her dangerous, because Aunt Lydia does not just follow Gilead's rules, she internalizes them, then adapts them. Then they become their most efficient interpreter. But the Testaments introduces something even more unsettling, a suggestion that Lydia's past is not just tragic, but deliberately erased in layers. Not just by Gilead, but possibly by Lydia herself. There are moments where her reactions feel too controlled, too precise, almost as if she were suppressing something beneath her authority. Something personal, something painful, something connected to lineage. That word, lineage, is important because it hints that Lydia's identity may extend beyond what she was allowed to become inside Gilead. And if that is true, then her role as Aunt Lydia is not just a promotion within the system. It is a replacement identity, a constructed self built on top of a buried original life. And that raises a disturbing question. What was so dangerous about who she used to be that it had to be erased so completely? One interpretation suggested by the story is that Lydia may have once been a woman who challenged authority in smaller, quieter ways, someone who believed in order but not oppression. A person who valued structure but not cruelty. But Gilead does not tolerate nuance. It forces everything into extremes. And those who survive within it often do so by abandoning the middle ground entirely. So Lydia adapts. Not because she agrees, but because she understands the cost of disagreement. And over time, adaptation becomes identity. That is the real horror of her transformation. Aunt Lydia is not simply a villain. She is a product of institutional reshaping, a person slowly rewritten by power until the original version no longer exists in any recognizable form. But the Testaments complicates even that interpretation because it does not present Lydia as completely empty inside. There are cracks, moments where emotion leaks through. Moments where her decisions feel less like cold calculation and more like controlled damage. As if she were constantly balancing between what she must do to survive the system and what she cannot entirely erase from her conscience. And that tension is where her darkest secret lives. Because Lydia's cruelty is not pure, it is negotiated. Every act of punishment carries an invisible weight of calculation. Every enforcement of Gilead's rules comes with an unspoken awareness of what those rules destroy. She does not enforce blindly, she enforces strategically. And that means she sees the cost of every action she takes, which makes her not less guilty, but more aware. And awareness changes everything. Because it suggests Lydia is not trapped in ignorance. She is trapped in participation. There is also the implication that Lydia understands something most others inside Gilead do not fully grasp, that systems of power are not sustained by belief alone, but by participation. People like Lydia are essential because they bridge ideology and enforcement. Without them, Gilead's structure collapses. That realization may be what keeps her aligned with the system, even when it fractures her internally. Because leaving is not simple. Leaving would mean vulnerability. And vulnerability, in Lydia's world, has always been punished. So she becomes what the system needs, even when it conflicts with what she might once have been. The most chilling part of the Testaments is how it reframes control as something that is not just imposed externally, but absorbed internally. Lydia is not just enforcing Gilead, she is carrying it inside her. And that makes her both powerful and imprisoned at the same time. That duality is the key to understanding her darkest secret. It is not that she enjoys cruelty. It is that she has become unable to separate herself from the structure that created it. And once that happens, identity becomes indistinguishable from duty. There is also a subtle emotional undercurrent that suggests Lydia may carry guilt that she cannot fully express. Not guilt in the traditional sense of regret, but something more fractured. A recognition that her survival required choices that harmed others, but also a recognition that refusing those choices would have meant her own destruction. That is the moral trap the Testaments places her inside. There is no clean exit, only continuation. And that is what makes her backstory so brutal. Not because it reveals a single traumatic event, but because it reveals a lifetime of incremental compromises that slowly erase the boundary between victim and enforcer. By the time Lydia becomes Aunt Lydia, she is no longer just surviving Gilead. She is maintaining it. And yet, the lingering question remains. Does she still remember who she was before all of this? The answer, the series seems to suggest, is yes. But memory is no longer comforting. It is dangerous. Because remembering creates conflict, and conflict threatens control. So Lydia suppresses it. Not completely, but enough to function, enough to continue, enough to remain useful to the system that reshaped her. And that is perhaps the darkest truth of all. Aunt Lydia is not just a symbol of Gilead's power. She is evidence of its method, a reminder that the system does not only break people through force, it rebuilds them into something unrecognizable, something capable of sustaining the very thing that destroyed them. And that is why her backstory matters, because it reveals that the most terrifying part of Gilead is not just its rules, but its ability to turn survival into complicity. And Aunt Lydia is the perfect example of that transformation, not because she is the most evil person inside Gilead, but because she is the most complete product of it.